Deep in the archives of history, where the ink of official records turns to shadows, there exists a silence that speaks louder than any broadcast. It is a silence born from the cold, a silence that hummed through the radio towers of the 1970s, carrying messages that weren't meant for human ears. Welcome to the classified edge of the map. This is Eldermurk. The year was 1978, a time when the world was a chessboard of tension, frozen in the perpetual standoff of the Cold War. But while the public watched the borders of Berlin and the rhetoric of Washington and Moscow, a different kind of war was being fought in the static. At a remote listening post in the Aleutian Islands, a young technician named Elias Thorne sat amidst a mountain of vacuum tubes and reel-to-reel tapes. His job was simple: listen to the Soviet long-range transmissions and look for the patterns that indicated troop movements or naval drills. But on the night of November 14th, the pattern he found didn't belong to any military manual. It began as a low-frequency pulse, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards of the station. Elias adjusted his headset, wincing at the sudden spike in decibels. It wasn't the usual woodpecker interference from the Soviet over-the-horizon radars. This was organic, yet mathematical. It had the cadence of a heartbeat, but the precision of a clock. Most disturbingly, the signal wasn't bouncing off the ionosphere from across the Pacific. According to the directional finders, the source was stationary. It was coming from Sector 4, a vast, uncharted stretch of the Siberian tundra that officially didn't exist on any Soviet civilian map. Elias recorded the signal, his hands trembling as he watched the needles on the frequency analyzer dance in hypnotic loops. He ran the transmission through the decryptor, expecting a wall of white noise or a standard KGB cipher. Instead, the machine spat out a string of coordinates followed by a single, recurring word in a dialect of Russian so archaic it hadn't been spoken in 3 centuries. Открыть, open. Within 6 hours of Elias filing his report, the listening post was no longer his. A team of men in charcoal suits, led by a colonel with eyes like flint named Harrison Vance, arrived via a blacked-out transport plane. They seized the tapes, wiped the hard drives, and issued Elias a non-disclosure agreement that carried the weight of a life sentence. Sector 4, Vance told him, was a ghost story, and Elias was to forget he ever heard ghosts talking. But Vance knew better. In the classified briefing rooms of the Pentagon, Sector 4 was known as the Blue Grave. It was the site of a failed Soviet experiment from the late 1950s, a project designed to tap into the ether to create a wireless power grid. The project had ended in a localized catastrophe that had literally erased a mountain from the landscape. For 20 years, the area had been a dead zone, a place where even birds refused to fly. Now, the Blue Grave was screaming. The American intelligence community couldn't afford to be curious. They had to be decisive. If the Soviets were reopening the grave, or if something inside had finally woken up, the balance of power wouldn't just shift, it would shatter. Vance was authorized to assemble a deniable asset team. This wasn't a group of soldiers. They were scavengers of the impossible. A disgraced physicist, a linguist specialized in dead tongues, and a lead operative whose heart had been hardened by the black ops of the Vietnam jungles. Their mission was simple on paper: infiltrate Sector 4, identify the source of the signal, and neutralize it before the Soviet 14th Army, currently mobilizing in the nearby Yakutsk region, could establish a perimeter. They were to fly in under the radar, literally, using an experimental stealth glider that left no heat signature. If they were captured, the United States would disavow their existence. They would be men without a country, lost in a land that didn't exist. As the team prepped in the hangar of a hidden base in Alaska, the physicist, Dr. Eris Thorne, Elias's distant uncle, brought in for his specific expertise in nonlinear dynamics, stared at the spectrograph of the signal. He didn't see radio waves. He saw a tear. "This isn't a broadcast, Colonel," Eris whispered. his voice barely audible over the hum of the glider's systems. "It's a resonance. Something is trying to tune the atmosphere of the Earth to a different frequency. If we don't stop it, the Blue Grave won't just be a localized disaster. It will become a doorway." Vance didn't care about doorways or frequencies. He cared about the fact that the Soviet mobilization was moving faster than anticipated. Satellite imagery showed a massive convoy of lead-line trucks heading toward the coordinates Elias had intercepted. The Soviets weren't just investigating, they were preparing to harvest. The glider launch was a silent plunge into the abyss. They crossed the Bering Strait in total darkness, the world below a jagged mosaic of ice and shadows. As they crossed the Siberian coastline, the electronics in the cockpit began to flicker. The compass spun aimlessly. The GPS, a primitive, top-secret version of what would one day be common, went dark. They were flying by instinct now, guided only by the lingering echo of that rhythmic pulse. Suddenly, the clouds parted. Below them, the tundra was no longer white. It was glowing with a pale, sickly indigo light. The mountain that had been erased was now a crater of glass, miles wide, and in the center of that crater stood a spire that defied the laws of architecture. It was a jagged tooth of obsidian, humming with a power that made the team's teeth ache and their vision blur. "Drop in 3, 2, 1. Vance commanded. They parachuted into the indigo mist, the air smelling of ozone and ancient dust. As their boots hit the glass floor of the crater, the silence of the tundra returned, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence. The spire loomed over them, a monument to a science that didn't belong to the 20th century. And then, the signal changed. The rhythmic heartbeat stopped. In its place came a voice. It didn't come from the radio. It didn't come from the spire. It came from inside their own heads, a collective whisper that vibrated through their skulls. "You are late," the voice said. "The opening is already complete." Vance gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. Dr. Eris Thorne fell to his knees, clutching his head as his nose began to bleed. Around them, the indigo mist began to thicken, taking shapes that mimicked the human form but moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. The Blue Grave was no longer a tomb. It was a nursery, and the things being born were hungry for the world they had just entered. The Soviet convoy was 10 miles out. The spire was vibrating with enough energy to level a continent, and the team was standing at the center of a threshold that was never meant to be crossed. The war for the static was over. The war for reality had just begun. The indigo mist didn't just obscure vision. It felt like a physical weight, a cold, damp shroud that tasted of copper and ancient electricity. Colonel Vance stood his ground, his boots grinding against the vitrified floor of the crater, while the rest of the team struggled to find their bearings. The voices in their heads hadn't just spoken. They had left a residue, a lingering sense of immense, cold intelligence that made every instinct scream for flight. "Form up." Vance's voice barked through the thick atmosphere, sounding muffled as if the air itself was absorbing the sound waves. "Thorne, get off the ground. We have a perimeter to establish." Dr. Eris Thorne stumbled to his feet, wiping the dark blood from his upper lip. His eyes were wide, fixed on the obsidian spire that now seemed to be breathing. "Colonel, we can't stay here," he stammered, his breath hitching in the frigid air. "The atmospheric ionization is off the charts. We are standing in the middle of a massive particle accelerator, and we are the only things not shielded." The third member of the team, Sarah Jenkins, the linguist whose specialty lay in deciphering Proto-Indo-European scripts, was staring at the base of the spire. She wasn't looking at the mist or the shadows. She was looking at the etchings that were appearing on the stone as the indigo light pulsed. "It's not just a doorway, Eris," she whispered, her voice trembling. It's an invitation. These symbols, they aren't Russian. They aren't even terrestrial. They are mathematical constants encoded as geometric shapes. It's a greeting. A greeting from what? Vance asked, his eyes scanning the mist. He raised his night vision goggles, but the indigo glow rendered them useless, blooming into a blinding wall of white light. From the things that lived here before the mountains were formed, Sarah replied. From the things that were waiting for us to find the frequency. Before Vance could respond, a low, mechanical growl echoed from the edge of the crater. It wasn't the sound of a creature, but the unmistakable roar of heavy diesel engines. The Soviet convoy. The 14th Army had arrived at the rim, and they weren't coming for a peaceful observation. Through the haze, the headlights of lead-lined BTR-60 armored personnel carriers cut through the dark like the eyes of predatory insects. "They're here," Vance said, his tone shifting into the cold, calculated resonance of a man who had seen too many jungles burn. "Jenkins, Thorne, get behind the spire's base. If the Soviets start shooting, they'll aim for us first. They think we're here to steal their prize." "Aren't we?" Eris asked, ducking behind a jagged outcropping of the black stone. "We're here to make sure no one has it," Vance replied. As the Soviet vehicles began to descend the steep, glassy slopes of the crater, the spire reacted. The indigo light shifted to a violet, searing ultraviolet. The humming sound intensified, rising in pitch until it surpassed the range of human hearing, leaving only a painful pressure in the inner ear. Suddenly, a beam of pure energy erupted from the tip of the spire, shooting straight up into the charcoal sky. It didn't illuminate the clouds. It pierced them, creating a perfect circular hole that revealed a starfield that looked wrong. The constellations were shifted, the stars too bright, too numerous. The lead Soviet vehicle reached the floor of the crater and came to a screeching halt. A hatch popped open, and a man in a heavy winter coat, flanked by soldiers in gas masks, stepped out. He held a megaphone to his face. "American intruders," the voice echoed in heavily accented English. "You are trespassing on the sovereign territory of the Soviet Union. This is a restricted scientific zone. Drop your weapons and step away from the artifact, or we will open fire." Vance didn't flinch. He knew the protocol. The Soviets were just as terrified as they were, perhaps even more so. They had lost an entire division here in '59, and the memories of that failed experiment were etched into their military DNA. "Major!" Vance shouted back, his voice projecting with an authority that seemed to challenge the spire itself. "Look at your instruments. This thing isn't a weapon you can control. It's a breach. If you fire, you might trigger a collapse that won't stop at the Siberian border." The Soviet major hesitated. He looked back at his science officer, who was frantically shaking a Geiger counter that was clicking so fast it sounded like a sustained scream. But the orders from Moscow were clear. The Americans must not be allowed to interfere with Project Blue Winter. "Fire!" the major commanded. A heavy machine gun mounted on the BTR opened up, the tracers carving lines of fire through the indigo mist. The bullets struck the spire, but they didn't ricochet. They slowed down, as if hitting a wall of invisible syrup, and then simply dropped to the ground, flattened into lead pancakes. The spire didn't like being hit. The ultraviolet beam widened. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with a rhythmic thud. Thump, 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 thump. The heartbeat was back, but now it was the heartbeat of a giant. From the indigo mist, the shapes Jenkins had noticed earlier began to solidify. They were tall, spindly, and translucent, appearing like glass sculptures filled with smoke. They didn't have faces, only voids where features should be. One of the entities drifted toward the Soviet line. The soldiers panicked, unleashing a volley of AK-47 fire. The bullets passed through the glass-like figures without effect. One soldier, a boy no older than 19, turned to run, but the entity touched his shoulder. In an instant, the soldier didn't die. He simply unraveled. His body disintegrated into a cloud of red mist and white light, which was immediately sucked into the entity's void-like center. "My God," Dr. Thorne whispered, clutching his chest. "They aren't killing us. They're consuming our entropy. They're feeding on our biological order to stabilize their own form in this dimension. Thorne, tell me how to shut it down." Vance yelled over the roar of the Soviet engines and the screams of the soldiers. "I can't," Thorne cried. "The spire is a tuning fork. To shut it down, we have to break the resonance, but we don't have the frequency. Sarah, the symbols. Look at the symbols again." Sarah Jenkins was pressed against the obsidian, her fingers tracing the glowing lines. She was crying, her eyes darting across the geometry. "It's a countdown, Eris. It's not a greeting. It's a timer." The signal Thorne heard in the Aleutians was the final pulse. The Blue Grave wasn't a project that failed. It was a project that succeeded in anchoring a beacon, and the beacon has just finished calling the rest of them. As she spoke, more holes began to appear in the sky, identical to the one above the spire. Across the Siberian tundra, perhaps across the entire planet, the Sector 4s of the world were waking up. The indigo light was no longer confined to the crater. It was spreading like a rising tide, swallowing the horizon. The Soviet major, seeing his men being turned into mist, lost his nerve. He scrambled back into his BTR and ordered a full retreat. But the vitrified floor of the crater had turned slick, and the heavy vehicles spun their wheels, sliding toward the center, toward the spire. "Vance, we have to move," Sarah yelled. "If those trucks hit the spire, the kinetic energy transfer will blow the breach wide open." Vance looked at the retreating Soviets, then at the entities closing in on their position. He looked at Dr. Thorne, who was holding a small, experimental pulse charge, a device intended to disrupt Soviet communications, but perhaps, just perhaps, enough to jar the spire's frequency. "Thorne, the charge," Vance ordered. "Give it to me." "It won't work from here, Colonel. You have to place it inside the resonance field, right at the base of the spire." Vance grabbed the device, his eyes locking onto the obsidian tower. Between him and the goal stood three of the smoke-filled entities, their voids turning toward him as if sensing a concentrated source of willpower. "Cover me," Vance said. It wasn't a request. He stepped out from the shadow of the stone and began to run. The air felt like liquid lead. Every step was a battle against a force that wanted to pull his molecules apart. The first entity drifted toward him, its long, spindly arm reaching out. Vance didn't fire his rifle. He knew lead was useless. He used his momentum to dive under the reaching limb, the coldness of the entity passing over him like a wave of liquid nitrogen. He was 20 feet from the spire. The ultraviolet light was so bright now it was burning his skin. His vision was tunneling, the edges of his world turning into static. "Artcrit," the voice whispered in his mind. "Open. Let us in." Vance reached the base of the spire. The stone wasn't cold. It was vibrating with a heat that felt like a sun trapped in a cage. He jammed the pulse charge into a narrow fissure in the obsidian and fumbled for the detonator. "Colonel, now!" Thorne's voice screamed from far away. Vance pressed the button. There was no explosion. Instead, there was a sound like a gargantuan glass window shattering. A wave of white pressure erupted from the charge, clashing with the indigo resonance. For a heartbeat, the world turned into a negative photograph. The spire groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that shook the very foundation of the earth. The beam of light in the sky flickered, turned red, and then imploded. The shock wave knocked Vance backward, his body skipping across the glass floor like a stone on a lake. The indigo mist vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, freezing darkness. The entities winked out of existence, leaving behind only the drifting red mist of the soldiers they had consumed. Silence returned to Sector 4, a silence so absolute it felt deafening. Vance lay on his back, gasping for air that no longer tasted of ozone. He looked up. The hole in the sky was gone. The normal, cold stars of Siberia looked down on them, indifferent and distant. Sarah and Eris ran toward him, their silhouettes dark against the pale moonlight. "Did we do it?" Sarah asked, helping Vance to sit up. Vance looked at the spire. It was no longer glowing, but a large crack now ran from its base to its tip. It looked dead, but as he watched, a single tiny spark of indigo light flickered deep within the crack. "We stopped the breach," Vance said, his voice raspy. "But the beacon is still here, and now they know exactly where we are." From the rim of the crater, the sound of more engines began to rise. Not the Soviets this time. These were faster, higher-pitched, jet engines. The Americans were coming to clean up the site, and Vance knew that in the world of Eldermurk, a cleanup rarely left survivors. The silence of Sector 4 was short-lived. Above the vitrified rim of the crater, the scream of twin-engine jet turbines tore through the Siberian night. These weren't Soviet MiGs. The distinct low-bypass howl belonged to the A-10 Warthogs of the Blacktail Squadron, a ghost unit that officially operated out of a non-existent base in the Yukon. "Cleanup crew is here," Colonel Vance muttered, pushing himself up. His ribs burned with every breath, a reminder of the shockwave that had thrown him across the glass floor. He looked at Dr. Thorne and Sarah Jenkins. They were pale, shivering in the sudden return of the sub-zero temperatures, their eyes fixed on the darkening sky. "They aren't here for the Soviets, are they?" Sarah asked, her voice thin. "They're here to sanitize the site, Sarah. In the eyes of the Pentagon, we've seen the breach, we've touched the artifact, and we've survived a resonance event. To them, we're no longer assets. We're contaminants." Vance reached for his radio, but the plastic casing had melted into a useless lump of polymer. The A-10s began their first pass, dropping white phosphorus flares that turned the indigo-stained crater into a blinding, hellish landscape of flickering shadows. The goal was simple: illuminate every inch of the crater before the napalm run. "Run!" Vance commanded, grabbing Thorne by the collar. "Toward the Soviet line. Their BTRs are lead-lined. It's our only chance of surviving the thermal bloom." As they sprinted across the vitrified glass, the Soviet BTRs were struggling to climb the crater's edge. The Soviet major, his face a mask of terror, was leaning out of the hatch of the lead vehicle, screaming orders at his driver. He saw the three Americans running toward him and raised his Makarov pistol, but his hand froze. He looked up at the American jets circling like vultures, then back at the cracked obsidian spire. "Get in!" the major roared in Russian, waving them toward the back of the armored carrier. It wasn't an act of mercy. It was a desperate realization that the only people who understood what had just happened were currently running for their lives. Vance, Thorne, and Sarah scrambled into the cramped, oil-smelling interior of the BTR just as the first canisters of napalm hit the center of the crater. Even through the lead-shielded walls of the vehicle, the heat was a physical blow. The air inside the BTR became a vacuum, the oxygen being sucked out by the massive firestorm outside. Thorne gasped for air, his lungs feeling like they were filled with hot sand. "Drive!" the Soviet major screamed. The BTR roared, its tires finally catching grip on a patch of unvitrified rock. It lurched forward, cresting the rim of the crater just as the second wave of American jets unleashed their payload directly onto the spire. From the small, reinforced vision slit of the BTR, Vance watched as the blue grave disappeared in a wall of orange fire. The spire, however, did not crumble. Even amidst the napalm, it stood like a dark, defiant finger, absorbing the heat, turning the orange flames back into that sickly, pulsing ultraviolet. 4 miles, they drove into the heart of the tundra, the Soviet convoy reduced to 3 battered vehicles. The American jets didn't pursue. Their mission was localized: destroy the breach point. Once the BTRs disappeared into the radar shadows of the Verkhoyansk Mountains, the blacktails headed back toward the Bering Strait. Inside the BTR, the tension was thick enough to choke. 6 Soviet soldiers sat opposite the 3 Americans, their rifles pointed at Vance's chest. The major, whose name tag read Kovac, sat at the end of the bench, staring at Dr. Thorne. "You are the physicist," Kovac said, his voice a low growl. "My science officer is dead." His brain. It turned to liquid inside his skull when that thing spoke. "Tell me, American, what did we wake up?" Dr. Thorne was clutching his notebook, his knuckles white. "It's called the Void Protocol, Major. Your scientists in 59 thought they were tapping into a power source. They weren't. They were building a bridge. Radio waves are just the beginning. The universe isn't made of matter. It's made of vibrations. If you find the right frequency, you can fold the distance between 2 points." "And the things?" Kovac asked. "The glass men." "Sentinels," Sarah Jenkins interrupted, her eyes distant. "They aren't explorers. They are the cleanup crew for the entities on the other side. They consume the local entropy to stabilize the gate. What you saw in the crater was just the scouting party, the signal we intercepted. It wasn't a call to them. It was a synchronization pulse." Vance watched Kovac's eyes. The Soviet officer wasn't a fanatic. He was a man who had just seen the laws of physics rewritten in blood. "Major," Vance said, "the Pentagon thinks we're dead. Your Kremlin probably thinks the same about you. Right now, we are the only people on this planet who know that the gate didn't fully close." Kovac looked at the crack in the vision slit. "What do you mean, not closed?" "The crack in the spire," Vance explained. "I saw it flicker before we ran. My pulse charge jammed the frequency, but it didn't shatter the crystal. It's like a door that's been slammed but didn't latch. It's still vibrating. And if it's vibrating, they can still hear us." Suddenly, the BTR's engine began to sputter. The lights on the dashboard flickered, turning from red to that haunting indigo. The soldiers' watches began to run backward. "It's happening again," Thorne whispered, his voice trembling. "Not from the crater. From here." He pointed to the metal floor of the BTR. A small, jagged piece of obsidian stone had caught in the tread of Vance's boot, a fragment of the spire, no larger than a coin. It was glowing, it was vibrating, and it was singing. The frequency was higher now, a piercing shriek that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in their teeth. The BTR slammed to a halt as the electrical system surged and died. Outside, the Siberian wind howled, but beneath the wind there was a new sound, a rhythmic, metallic tapping on the hull of the vehicle. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the sound of rain or branches. It was the sound of long, spindly fingers testing the strength of the armor. "They didn't stay in the crater," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "The fragment. It's a mobile beacon. We brought it with us. Vance drew his sidearm, knowing it was useless, but the instinct to fight was all he had left. "Major," he said, looking at Kovac, "does this thing have a manual override for the hatches?" Kovac nodded slowly, his face drained of color. "Yes. But why would you want to open it?" "Because," Vance said, "if we stay in here, we're trapped in a lead-line tin can with a beacon that's calling them to dinner. We have to ditch the fragment and move on foot." "To where?" Kovac asked. "There is nothing for 500 kilometers but ice and wolves." "There's an old Soviet weather station in Sector 7, Thorne said, his voice regaining some strength. "My uncle's notes mentioned it. It was built with high-frequency dampeners to protect against the 59 event. If we can get there, we can shield the fragment and figure out how to neutralize it." The tapping on the hull grew louder, more frantic. The metal of the BTR's roof began to groan, as if a massive weight was settling on top of it. A faint indigo mist began to seep through the seals of the hatch. "Major," Vance said, his finger on the trigger, "open the hatch on my mark. We run for the trees. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't let those things touch your shadow." Kovac gripped the manual lever. The Soviet soldiers braced themselves, their gas masks making them look like hollow-eyed demons in the indigo gloom. 3, 2, 1. Mark! The hatch blew open with a hiss of pressurized air. Vance leapt out into the snow, the fragment in his boot glowing like a dying star. The Siberian night was no longer dark. The forest was alive with shifting, translucent shapes that moved between the birch trees with terrifying speed. They were no longer in a cold war. They were in a race against a vibration that was slowly unraveling the world. The Siberian forest was a skeletal graveyard of birch and pine, their branches encrusted with ice that looked like jagged teeth under the moon. Vance, Thorne, and Sarah plunged into the waist-deep snow, followed closely by Major Kovac and his remaining 4 soldiers. The beater sat behind them, a dark tomb pulsing with a dying indigo light as the fragment in the snow near the vehicle began to warp the very air around it. "Keep moving," Vance roared, his breath forming thick plumes of frost. "Don't break the trail." The sentinels were not running. They were flickering. One moment, a translucent figure would be standing 50 yards away between 2 trees. The next, it was 20 yards closer, its movement a series of jagged, frame-by-frame leaps through reality. They moved like glitches in a film strip, silent and unstoppable. One of the Soviet soldiers, a man named Volkov, stumbled. His boot caught on a hidden root, and he went down hard. Before Kovac could reach for him, a sentinel appeared directly over the fallen man. It didn't strike or bite. It simply leaned down, its void-like face inches from Volkov's. The soldier didn't even have time to scream. His body turned into a blurred smear of red and white, his physical form vibrating so fast it became a liquid mist, which the sentinel inhaled in a single, shivering breath. The soldier's rifle clattered to the frozen ground, twisted and melted as if it had been through a furnace. "Don't look back," Kovac screamed, grabbing the next soldier by the webbing of his vest and shoving him forward. "To the ridge. Move." Dr. Thorne was struggling, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The resonance. It's building," he gasped, clutching his head. "I can feel it in my marrow. The fragment. It's not just a beacon anymore. It's a synchronizer. It's trying to pull this entire forest into the frequency of the void." They reached the crest of the ridge, and for a moment the trees thinned. Below them, nestled in a valley that seemed untouched by the indigo mist, stood the weather station. It was a cluster of low, reinforced concrete buildings topped with a massive, spherical antenna array that looked like a rusted eye staring at the stars. "Sector 7, Thorne whispered, hope flaring in his eyes. The dampeners are in the basement. If the lead shielding is still intact, we can drown out the signal. As they scrambled down the slope, the air began to hum with a sound like 1,000 angry bees. The ground beneath them didn't just shake, it rippled. The snow began to float upward in tiny, crystalline spheres, defying gravity as the local laws of physics began to dissolve. "They're closing the loop," Sarah Jenkins yelled, her voice straining against the rising shriek of the atmosphere. "The Sentinels are creating a localized stasis field. If we don't get inside those concrete walls, we'll be unraveled like Volkov." They reached the heavy steel door of the main bunker. Kovac slammed his shoulder against it, but the lock was frozen solid by decades of Siberian winter. "It won't budge," he cursed, slamming his fist against the metal. Vance stepped forward, drawing a block of C4 from his tactical vest. "Get back," he ordered. He pressed the explosive against the door's hinges, wired a short-fuse detonator, and dove into the snow. The explosion was a dull thud in the heavy, pressurized air. The door groaned and tilted inward. Vance kicked it open, and the team scrambled into the pitch-black interior. Kovac slammed the door shut behind them, throwing a heavy iron bar across the frame. The silence inside was immediate and suffocating. The concrete walls were 4 feet thick, laced with a lead copper mesh designed to withstand the electromagnetic pulses of a nuclear blast, or something far stranger. "Flashlights," Vance commanded. Beams of light cut through the darkness, revealing a room frozen in time. Soviet propaganda posters from the 50s peeled from the walls. Rolls of ticker tape lay scattered like dead snakes, and in the center of the room sat a massive vacuum tube computer bank, its glass components dusty but unbroken. "The basement, Thorne. Lead the way," Vance said. They descended a rusted spiral staircase into the bowels of the station. The air grew colder, smelling of ozone and ancient grease. At the bottom, they found a room filled with massive, lead-shielded cabinets. These were the dampeners, monstrously large capacitors designed to absorb and ground high-frequency anomalies. Thorne ran to a control panel, his fingers flying over switches he hadn't touched in years but had memorized from his uncle's classified journals. "I need power. Major, check the auxiliary generators in the next room." Kovac and his men disappeared into the shadows, and moments later, a low, mechanical cough echoed through the floor. The generator sputtered, roared to life, and the lights in the basement flickered with a dim, yellow glow. The dampeners began to hum, a deep, grounding bass note that pushed back against the piercing shriek in their heads. "It's working," Sarah said, leaning against a lead cabinet. The nosebleed she'd had since the crater finally began to clot. "The pressure. It's lifting." But Vance remained by the stairs, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "We're not safe yet. We're just in a bunker, and we still have a problem." He pointed to his boot. The small fragment of obsidian was still there, embedded in the rubber. It was no longer glowing ultraviolet. It had turned a deep, bruised purple. It was vibrating so intensely that the floor around Vance's foot was starting to crack. "We can't just leave it here," Thorne said, looking at the fragment with terror. "Even with the dampeners, if this thing reaches critical resonance, it will turn this bunker into a localized black hole. We have to neutralize the vibration." "How?" Vance asked. "The resonance is mathematical," Sarah said, stepping toward them. "It's a language. If we can provide a counter-frequency, an inverse wave, we can cancel it out, like noise-canceling headphones, but for reality." "The antenna array," Thorne realized, looking up at the ceiling. The spherical array on the roof. It wasn't just for listening. It was a transmitter. My uncle called it the lullaby. It was designed to broadcast a low-frequency grounding wave across the sector. "You're saying we have to go back out there?" Kovac asked, standing in the doorway, his face grim. "The glass things are waiting. They are probably circling this building right now." "Not all of us," Vance said, his voice flat. "I'll go. I have the fragment. It's tuned to me now." "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You don't know the mathematics. You need me to calibrate the transmission, and Thorn needs to bridge the computer's logic to the array." Vance looked at the small, battered team. An American operative, a physicist, a linguist, and a Soviet major. In the shadows of Eldermurk, the lines of the Cold War had vanished, replaced by a much darker reality. "Check your magazines," Vance said, his hand lingering on the grip of his pistol. "We're going to the roof. Major, your men stay here and guard the generators. If the power fails, we all die." Kovac nodded, snapping a fresh magazine into his rifle. "Go. We will hold the basement. For the motherland, or whatever is left of it." Vance, Thorn, and Sarah began the climb. As they reached the top floor, the sound of the sentinels returned. It wasn't a tapping this time. It was a rhythmic, grinding sound, like sandpaper on stone. The entities were trying to vibrate their way through the concrete walls. Vance kicked open the hatch to the roof. The Siberian wind hit them like a physical blow, but it was the sky that stopped their hearts. The indigo clouds had formed a perfect, swirling vortex directly above the station. At the center of the vortex, the stars were disappearing, replaced by a vast, pulsating void that looked like a closing eye. "The synchronization is almost complete," Thorn screamed over the wind. "The fragment is opening a localized gate." Vance limped toward the center of the spherical antenna, the obsidian fragment in his boot now glowing with a blinding, rhythmic light. Thump, 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 thump. The heartbeat of the void was accelerating. "Do it now," Vance yelled. Sarah and Thorn dove for the manual override panel at the base of the antenna. Sarah's fingers danced over the dials, her mind racing through the geometric constants she had seen on the spire. Setting the inverse wave. 440 Hz. 528. Adjusting for atmospheric density. Thorn pulled a heavy lever. The massive spherical array began to rotate, its rusted gears screaming in protest. A deep, resonant hum began to emanate from the metal structure, a sound so low it felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. The indigo vortex above them hesitated. The sentinels, who had been shimmering on the edge of the roof, suddenly recoiled, their translucent forms flickering violently. "It's working," Sarah cried. "The lullaby is grounding the signal." But the fragment in Vance's boot didn't go dark. It turned a fiery, angry red. The heat became unbearable. Vance fell to his knees, the rubber of his boot beginning to melt. "It's fighting back," Thorn yelled. "The fragment is pulling power from the void to override the dampeners. Colonel, you have to get rid of it." Vance looked at the fragment, then at the void in the sky. He knew that if he threw it, it would just find a new anchor. He had to destroy the resonance at the source. He looked at the massive electrical conduit feeding the antenna array. "Thorn, if I bridge the fragment directly into the capacitor bank, will it short out the frequency? It will cause a localized electromagnetic surge, Vance. It'll incinerate everything on this roof." Vance looked at Sarah, then at Thorn. "Get to the stairwell. Now." "Vance, no," Sarah screamed. "Go." Vance didn't wait. He grabbed a heavy copper cable from the exposed wiring of the antenna and wrapped it around his boot. right over the glowing obsidian. He looked up at the swirling indigo eye in the sky. "Welcome to Earth," he whispered. "Now get the hell off my planet." He slammed the cable into the main power junction. A blinding flash of white light consumed the roof. There was no sound, only a massive, crushing pressure that felt like the world being turned inside out. The indigo vortex shattered into a million pieces of harmless light, falling like snow toward the tundra. The void in the sky vanished, replaced by the cold, quiet stars of Siberia. When the light faded, Sarah and Thorn crawled back onto the roof. The antenna array was a melted skeleton of blackened metal. The concrete was scorched, and in the center of the roof, Vance lay still, his boot a charred ruin. They ran to him. He was breathing, his face blackened by the surge, but his eyes were open. He looked down at his foot. The obsidian fragment was gone. In its place was a small pile of fine, grey ash. The lullaby had worked. The frequency had been broken. But as they stood there in the silence of the Siberian night, a new sound began to drift across the wind. It wasn't a shriek, and it wasn't a hum. It was a broadcast, a clear, rhythmic pulse coming from every direction at once. Thorn pulled a small, portable radio from his pocket. The needle was jumping. He tuned the dial, and a voice, human but distorted, began to speak in every language simultaneously. "The protocol is not a door," the voice said. "It is a clock, and the first hour has just struck." The broadcast didn't just fill the airwaves. It seemed to vibrate the very moisture in the air. On the scorched roof of the weather station, Vance, Thorn, and Sarah stood paralyzed as the distorted voice echoed from Thorn's handheld radio. The lullaby had grounded the local gate, but the void protocol was far larger than a single Siberian crater. "The clock is ticking," Sarah whispered, repeating the voice's final words. "Eris, what did it mean?" "The first hour." Dr. Thorn didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the radio's frequency dial. The needle wasn't just jumping, it was vibrating so fast it appeared blurred. "It's a global synchronization," he finally said, his voice cracking. The fragment Vance destroyed was just a local anchor, but the voice, that broadcast isn't coming from a tower. It's coming from the ionosphere itself. They've turned the Earth's atmosphere into a giant speaker. Vance grunted as he tried to stand, leaning heavily on a blackened strut of the antenna. His tactical suit was scorched, and his breathing was ragged. "If they can talk to us, they can find us. We need to move. Now." They descended back into the bunker, where Major Kovac and his two remaining soldiers stood with weapons leveled at the hatch. The tension was a living thing. Kovac's eyes scanned Vance's charred gear, settling on the empty space where the obsidian fragment had been. "Is it dead?" Kovac asked, his finger still hovering near the trigger of his AK-47. "For now," Vance replied, "but the world just got a wake-up call. We need to get to your command center in Yakutsk. You have long-range comms there that aren't tied to the civilian grid, right?" Kovac lowered his rifle slowly. "Yakutsk is 500 kilometers of frozen hell away, and if your protocol is global, my generals will be in a bunker, and the city will be in chaos." "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, stepping forward. "The broadcast mentioned a clock. If we can reach a high-power transmitter, we might be able to use Eris's inverse frequency to jam the global synchronization before the second hour strikes." They piled into the remaining Soviet BTR, the metal interior feeling like a cold, cramped coffin. As they drove away from Sector 7, the sky behind them didn't return to the normal black of night. It stayed a bruised, electrical purple. The lullaby had saved them. but it had also marked the weather station as a point of resistance. The journey across the tundra was a nightmare of shifting reality. Every few miles, the BTR's headlights would catch glimpses of the sentinels standing perfectly still among the trees. They weren't attacking anymore. They were waiting. "They're waiting for the next pulse," Thorne noted, his eyes glued to the frequency analyzer. Every time the voice speaks, the local reality thins. "Look at the trees, Vance." Vance looked. The birch trees weren't just frozen. They were becoming translucent. The snow under the BTR's tires felt less like ice and more like fine, grey sand. The physical world was being recoded, its molecular stability sacrificed to make room for the void's arrival. 3 hours into the drive, the radio crackled again. The voice was clearer now, less distorted. It sounded almost human, but with an underlying resonance that suggested multiple throats speaking in unison. "The second hour has struck," the voice announced. "The weight of the old world is being shed. Prepare for the transition." Immediately, the BTR groaned. The heavy steel plates of the vehicle began to hum, and the engine died with a violent jolt. Outside, the world turned upside down. Literally. For a terrifying moment, gravity ceased to exist. The BTR lifted off the ground, floating 6 feet in the air. Vance, Sarah, and the soldiers tumbled in the weightless interior, reaching for handholds that felt like they were made of smoke. Through the vision slits, they saw the tundra rising, vast sheets of ice and earth floating into the purple sky like giant, shattered mirrors. "Eris! The dampener!" Vance yelled, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of zero gravity. Thorne fumbled for a portable version of the Sector 7 device he had salvaged. He flipped the switch, and a localized thump of low-frequency sound vibrated through the BTR. Gravity returned with a bone-shattering crash. The BTR slammed back onto the ground, its suspension screaming as it absorbed the impact. "We can't keep doing this," Kovac wheezed, clutching a broken arm. "The world is falling apart." "We're almost there," Sarah said, pointing ahead. Through the swirling mist and floating debris, the lights of Yakutsk appeared on the horizon. But they weren't the warm, yellow lights of a city. They were cold, flickering beacons of indigo. As they approached the outskirts, the scale of the transition became clear. The city was a war zone, but not one fought with bullets. Buildings were partially phased out of existence, their upper floors floating in the air while the foundations remained on the ground. People, civilians and soldiers alike, wandered the streets in a trance-like state, their bodies flickering like failing light bulbs. "They're being synchronized," Thorne whispered, his face pale. "Their nervous systems are being tuned to the void's frequency. If we don't stop the broadcast, there won't be a human race left to save. Just 1 billion biological antennas." Vance checked his sidearm. He had 1 magazine left. Kovac had a handful of grenades. Against an extra-dimensional invasion, it was like bringing a toothpick to a tank fight. But Eldermurk had taught him one thing. Even a small grain of sand can grind a massive machine to a halt if you put it in the right gear. "The Yakutsk command hub is under the central plaza," Kovac said, his military training overriding his fear. "It's a deep-crust bunker, shielded against a 5-megaton blast. If the global transmitter is still online, it's there." They ditched the BTR a mile from the plaza, moving on foot through the flickering ruins. The sentinels were everywhere now, standing on rooftops like gargoyles, their void faces turned toward the sky. They ignored the team, focused entirely on the unfolding second hour. They reached the entrance to the hub, a nondescript concrete blockhouse guarded by 2 Soviet sentries. The sentries weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. They stood at attention, their eyes glowing with that familiar ultraviolet light, their rifles fused to their hands. "Don't touch them," Vance warned. They slipped past the frozen guards and entered the elevator. As they descended into the deep-crust bunker, the air grew colder and the hum of the world's unraveling grew louder. The elevator doors opened to a scene of frozen chaos. High-ranking officers sat at their consoles, their hands frozen over buttons, their faces caught in expressions of eternal shock. "There," Thorne said, pointing to the massive central array. "The Global Strategic Broadcast System. It's designed to override every radio station in the hemisphere for emergency war orders." "How do we use it to jam the void?" Vance asked, scanning the room for any active threats. "We don't just jam it," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the complex technical manuals on the desks. "We have to reverse the polarity of the entire ionosphere. We use the void's own energy against it. Like a mirror." Thorne began feverishly rewiring the main console, his hands trembling. "I need a power source that can hit the terawatt range. The bunker's reactors won't be enough." "What about the void itself?" Sarah asked. "If the city is saturated with indigo energy, can we harvest it?" "It's risky," Thorne said. "If we tap into it, we're essentially opening a door right into this room." "Open it," Vance said, his eyes on the elevator. The indigo mist was beginning to seep through the seams of the doors. The sentinels had realized that the contaminants were trying to interrupt the clock. "Vance, they're coming," Kovac warned, his soldiers taking positions behind the heavy steel desks. "Then give them a hell of a welcome," Vance replied. As Thorne connected the final lead, the lights in the bunker turned a blinding, violent purple. The voice on the radio returned, but this time it wasn't a broadcast. It was a roar. "The third hour is upon you. Resistance is an error of mathematics. Surrender your form." The elevator doors crumpled like paper. 3 sentinels stepped into the room, their translucent bodies crackling with the stolen energy of the city above. "Thorne, do it now," Vance screamed, unleashing his final magazine into the lead entity. The bullets did nothing, but the kinetic force slowed it down for a fraction of a second. Thorne slammed the master switch. The entire bunker shook as a massive surge of power ripped through the strategic array. A beam of pure white frequency, the lullaby on a global scale, shot upward through the layers of concrete and earth, piercing the indigo sky over Yakutsk. The effect was instantaneous. The indigo clouds shattered. The floating buildings slammed back to earth. The sentinels in the room shrieked, a sound like metal being torn, and dissolved into grey ash. For a moment, the world felt solid again. But then, the white beam began to turn red. "Eris, what's happening?" Sarah yelled. Thorne stared at the monitors in horror. The reverse polarity. It's not just jamming them, it's pulling them through. The array is acting as a vacuum. The strategic hub began to moan as the walls started to buckle. They weren't being attacked. They were being sucked into the very machine they had built to save themselves. "Vance, we have to shut it down," Sarah cried. "I can't," Thorne yelled. "The feedback loop is self-sustaining. It's going to turn this bunker into a singularity." Vance looked at the screaming array, then at his team. They had stopped the second hour, but in doing so, they had triggered something far more dangerous. The Void Protocol wasn't just a clock. It was a trap, and they had just walked right into the heart of it. The strategic hub was no longer a room. It was a throat, and it was screaming. The red light bleeding from the transmission array didn't just illuminate the bunker. It burned. It was the color of a dying sun, a predatory hue that signaled the transition from a broadcast to a physical manifestation. "The vacuum effect is accelerating," Dr. Thorne yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of collapsing physics. He was clinging to the bolted-down console, his legs lifted off the floor by the sheer gravitational pull of the array. "Vance!" The inverse wave didn't just mirror them, it anchored them. "We aren't jamming the signal anymore. We're providing the umbilical cord." Vance jammed his combat knife into the floor plating, using it as an anchor to keep from being sucked into the glowing core of the strategic broadcast system. He looked at Sarah. She was pressed against the back wall, her eyes fixed on the monitors. The geometric symbols she had decoded at the spire were now scrolling across the Soviet screens at light speed, but they were no longer static. They were evolving, rewriting the bunker's operating system into something alien. "Sarah, the override!" Vance roared. "There is no override," she screamed back. "The mathematics have turned recursive. It's a self-filling void. The only way to stop the loop is to break the physical medium." Major Kovac, despite his broken arm, was trying to reach the primary cooling pipes with a thermal grenade. "If I blow the coolant, the whole hub goes up," he shouted. "No," Thorne cried out. "The energy isn't thermal, it's informational. If you blow the room, you just scatter the frequency across the entire tectonic plate. You'll turn the whole of Siberia into a permanent breach." Suddenly, the red light pulsed, and the sound died. A heavy, unnatural silence filled the bunker, more terrifying than the roar. In the center of the array, the air began to peel back like a scorched piece of paper. Through the tear, they didn't see stars or clouds. They saw a vast, crystalline structure, a city of obsidian and light that stretched into an infinite, violet horizon. And standing at the edge of that tier was something that wasn't a sentinel. It was shaped like a man, but it was composed of shifting geometric planes, its surface a mirror reflecting 1,000 different versions of the bunker. It didn't move with muscles, it moved with logic. As it stepped onto the concrete floor, the very ground turned into glass beneath its feet. "The architect," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with a terrifying awe. "It's not an invader, it's the surveyor. It's here to finalize the foundation." The entity raised a hand, a jagged limb of obsidian, and the two Soviet soldiers guarding the perimeter didn't even have time to raise their rifles. They didn't mist away like the others. They were simply edited. One moment they were there, and the next, the space they occupied was empty, as if they had been erased from the world's memory. Vance felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the Siberian winter. He realized that the Void Protocol wasn't about destruction. It was about replacement. They were being deleted to make room for a more stable reality. "Thorne, the lullaby," Vance commanded, his mind racing. "If we can't jam it, can we shift the phase? Can we push the bunker just 1 millisecond out of sync with the rest of the world?" Thorne's eyes lit up with a desperate brilliance. "A phase shift? Yes. If we can't stop the arrival, we can make sure they arrive in a frequency that doesn't overlap with ours, like two ghosts passing through each other." "Do it!" Thorne began to bypass the array's safety limiters, his fingers moving with a frantic, rhythmic precision. "I need to dump the entire bunker's electrical load into the phase coils. It will fry every piece of technology from here to the Arctic Circle, but it might just put us in the blind spot of the void." The architect began to move toward the console. Each step it took caused the bunker's walls to shudder and groan. It wasn't walking, it was redefining the space around it. "Kovac, grenades, now!" Vance ordered. Kovac didn't hesitate. He pulled the pins on his remaining 3 grenades and hurled them not at the entity, but at the ceiling supports directly above the tear. The explosion was small, but it was enough to drop a ton of reinforced concrete and lead shielding between the team and the architect. It didn't stop the entity, but it created a momentary physical obstruction in a reality that was becoming increasingly non-physical. Phase shift at 80%. Thorn yelled. The air in the room began to shimmer like a desert heat mirage. Vance looked at his own hands. They were becoming translucent, the edges of his form blurring into the grey concrete of the bunker. The architect reached the pile of rubble and simply walked through it, the concrete stones turning into a fine, purple mist as they touched its skin. It raised its hand toward Thorn, the geometric planes of its face shifting into a pattern that felt like a question. Why do you cling to a fading vibration? The voice didn't come from the air. It vibrated through their very DNA. The third hour is the end of friction, the end of decay. Join the symmetry. We like our friction. Vance snarled, lunging forward. He didn't use his gun. He grabbed a heavy copper grounding cable that was still live with the phase shift energy and leaped at the entity. As Vance's hands, wrapped in the cable, touched the obsidian surface of the architect, a blinding flash of white-blue sparks erupted. The friction Vance mentioned became a literal, violent reality. The phase shift energy, designed to move the bunker out of sync, clashed with the architect's perfect symmetry. The entity recoiled, its geometric form flickering and distorting like a corrupted video file. For the first time, it emitted a sound, a shrill, disharmonious screech that shattered every piece of glass in the hub. 95%. Thorn screamed, his teeth bleeding from the sonic pressure. Vance, let go. If you stay attached, you'll be shifted with the bunker. Vance didn't let go. He could feel his very soul being tugged in two different directions. He saw the obsidian city through the tear, and for a split second, he understood the architect's words. It was a world without pain, without war, without Eldermurk. It was perfect, and it was dead. Now, Eris, trigger it, Vance yelled. Thorn slammed his fist onto the final initiator. The world didn't explode. It vanished. For a timeless interval, there was no bunker, no Yakutsk, no Siberia. There was only a vast, grey emptiness where sound and light were meaningless. And then, with the force of a physical punch, reality slammed back into place. Vance hit the floor hard. The air was cold, normal, biting Siberian cold. The red light was gone. The architect was gone. The tear in the air had vanished, leaving only a scorched, blackened mark on the concrete floor. He looked around. The bunker was in ruins. The strategic broadcast system was a melted pile of slag. Thorn was slumped over the console, unconscious but breathing. Sarah was sitting on the floor, staring at her hands, which were solid once again. Did we win? Kovac asked, coughing out a cloud of grey dust. Vance stood up, his body aching in ways he couldn't describe. He looked at the monitors that were still flickering with auxiliary power. The global map didn't show indigo spots anymore. The transition seemed to have been halted, but as he walked toward the elevator, he saw something that stopped him cold. On the scorched floor, where the architect had stood, there was a footprint, not a human one, but a perfect geometric indentation in the concrete. And inside that footprint, the grey stone was slowly, rhythmically pulsing with a faint, ultraviolet light. "We didn't win, Major," Vance said, his voice a hollow rasp. "We just went into hiding." He looked at Thorn's handheld radio, which had survived the shift. He turned it on. There was no distorted voice. There was no rhythmic pulse. There was only static. But as he listened, the static began to change. It started to form a pattern, a new code. The void hadn't been pushed back to its own dimension. They had just shifted the Earth into a frequency where the void couldn't see them. Yet, they were now living in the shadow of their own world, a ghost planet hiding from a predator that was still listening. "The fourth hour," Sarah whispered, looking at the radio. "What happens when they stop looking and start feeling for us?" Vance didn't answer. He just looked at the elevator doors. Beyond them, the city of Yakutsk was silent. The blue grave had finally claimed the world, not by destroying it, but by turning it into a secret that could never be told. The phase shift had been a desperate gamble, a frantic leap into the unknown that left the survivors of Sector 4 stranded in a world that looked like Earth but felt like a hollowed-out shell. Outside the Yakutsk bunker, the sky was no longer indigo, but it wasn't blue either. It was a flat, matte grey, the color of old lead, and the sun was nothing more than a pale, heatless disk hanging in the haze. Colonel Vance led the remnants of the team out of the underground hub. Major Kovac followed, his face a mask of weary resignation, while Eris Thorne and Sarah Jenkins walked in a daze, their senses still reeling from the transition. As they stepped onto the streets of Yakutsk, the silence was absolute. There were no birds, no wind, and no voices. "Where is everyone?" Sarah whispered, her voice sounding unnaturally sharp in the dead air. The city wasn't empty, but it was changed. Hundreds of people stood in the plazas and on the sidewalks, perfectly motionless. They weren't frozen in fear. They were simply paused. They stood like statues, their eyes open and glazed, staring at points in the grey sky that only they could see. "The synchronization was interrupted," Dr. Thorne said, his voice trembling as he leaned in to examine a woman standing by a bus stop. He waved a hand in front of her eyes. No blink, no reaction. "When we shifted the bunker's frequency, we pulled the local reality out of alignment with the void. But these people, they were already partially tuned. Now they're caught between two stations. They are ghosts in a world that no longer knows how to render them." "Can we wake them up?" Kovac asked, his hand hovering near the shoulder of one of his silent soldiers. "Don't touch them," Thorne warned sharply. "Their molecular stability is tied to a frequency we just broke. If you jar their physical form, they might simply dissolve into the grey." Vance ignored the statues and focused on the horizon. He could still feel a faint, rhythmic thrumming in his teeth, a ghost of the vibration that had nearly unraveled them. "The shift didn't solve the problem, Eris. It just bought us a blind spot. How long until the architect realizes the map has been changed?" "The architect doesn't realize things like we do," Thorne replied, pulling out his damaged frequency analyzer. "It's an algorithmic entity. It will scan the spectrum until it finds the anomaly. Us. We are a pocket of static in a perfect sea of symmetry. Eventually, the sea will find the rock." As they moved toward the outskirts of the city, seeking a vehicle that hadn't been fried by the electromagnetic surge, they noticed the corruptions. In the grey light, certain objects were beginning to glitch. A brick wall would suddenly flicker and turn into a waterfall of tumbling geometric cubes before snapping back. A street lamp would stretch toward the sky like a blade of grass. The phase shift was failing. The hidden reality was being reclaimed by the void's dominant frequency. "We need a more permanent shield," Vance said, kicking the tires of a heavy-duty Ural truck that seemed to have survived the pulse. "Thorne, you mentioned a site in the Ural Mountains during the briefing, Base 211. You said it was built into a natural deposit of magnetic magnetite." "The Black Mountain," Thorne nodded. "The magnetite there acts as a natural Faraday cage on a tectonic scale. If we can get there, we can set up a permanent resonance anchor. We can create a sanctuary that the void's scans can't penetrate. Then that's where we go," Vance decided. They began the long, grueling journey westward across the silent heart of the Soviet Union. For days, they drove through a landscape that looked like a faded photograph. Every town they passed was filled with the same paused citizens, thousands of human monuments to a lost world. The deeper they drove into the wilderness, the more the world began to bleed. Huge, jagged tears appeared in the sky, revealing glimpses of the obsidian city they had seen in the bunker. These weren't breaches, they were overlaps. The two dimensions were grinding against each other like tectonic plates, and the friction was creating localized storms of static fire, bolts of white energy that didn't burn but instead erased whatever they hit. Inside the truck, Sarah Jenkins was obsessively sketching the symbols she had seen on the architect's skin. "It's not just mathematics, Saris," she said, showing her notebook to Thorn. "It's a set of instructions. The void isn't just taking over, it's rewriting the past. These symbols represent the removal of variables. They are erasing human history to make the current transition logical. If they erase the past, we never existed," Thorn whispered. "That's why the statues don't move. They have no history to drive them forward." On the fifth day, they reached the foothills of the Ural Mountains. The air here felt different, heavier, more grounded. The magnetite in the earth was pushing back against the void's frequency, creating a pocket of real world that felt like a breath of fresh air. But as they climbed toward the coordinates of Base 211, they saw that they weren't the only ones who had figured out the Black Mountain's secret. A massive Soviet military blockade stood at the base of the mountain pass. Tanks, artillery, and thousands of soldiers were entrenched in the grey mud. But these soldiers weren't paused. They were very much alive, and they were terrified. "Halt!" A voice boomed over a loudspeaker as the Ural truck approached. "This is a restricted zone under the authority of the High Command. Identify yourselves or be destroyed." Kovac stood up in the back of the truck, his tattered Soviet uniform a mark of his rank. "Major Alexei Kovac, 14th Army. I am with an international task force. We have information regarding the transition." The soldiers lowered their weapons tentatively. A colonel with a face like cracked leather stepped forward. He looked at Kovac, then at Vance and the Americans. He didn't ask for papers. He didn't ask about the Cold War. He looked at the sky, where a massive obsidian spire was beginning to manifest over the peak of the Black Mountain. "The world is dying, Major," the colonel said, his voice a hollow rasp. "My men are holding the line against things that don't bleed. We don't care who you are. We only care if you can stop that spire from finishing its pulse." Vance looked up at the mountain. The void had found them. The architect had anticipated the blind spot and was already building a new beacon right on top of their only hope for sanctuary. "We don't just want to stop it, Colonel," Vance said, stepping out of the truck. "We want to use it to broadcast a signal that will wake up those statues in Yakutsk. We're going to give the world its history back." As the first static storm of the Urals began to brew, Vance checked his gear. They were at the gates of the Black Mountain, and the fourth hour was about to strike. The war for the past was beginning, and in Eldermurk, the past is the only weapon that never runs out of ammunition. The Black Mountain did not just loom, it seemed to exert a gravitational pull on the soul. As the Ural truck climbed the winding path toward Base 211, the magnetite in the cliffs groaned under the pressure of the manifesting spire above. The sky here was a bruised mix of leaden grey and that persistent, sickly ultraviolet. "The magnetite is struggling," Dr. Thorne noted, his eyes fixed on a handheld sensor that was smoking at the seams. "It's acting like a lightning rod for the void's entropy. We're standing on the only stable ground left in the hemisphere, but the spire is trying to ground the entire void right into the mountain's core." Colonel Vance looked at the Soviet entrenchments. Thousands of men were huddled in foxholes, their eyes fixed on the peak. They were the old guard, the ones who hadn't been synchronized yet, but their grip on reality was slipping. Some were staring at their own hands, watching as their skin flickered between flesh and grey static. "We don't have hours, Eris. We have minutes," Vance said, his voice hard as the mountain stone. They reached the entrance of Base 211, a massive blast door set into the side of a sheer magnetite cliff. The Soviet colonel, whose name was Volkov, met them at the threshold. He didn't offer a salute. He offered a heavy, lead-lined briefcase. "This was sent from Moscow by courier before the rails turned to glass," Volkov said. "It contains the Omega frequency. Our scientists at the Institute of High Temperatures were working on a weapon to shatter the 59 event. They failed to build the transmitter, but they perfected the code." Thorne grabbed the briefcase as if it were the Holy Grail. "The Omega frequency. It's a destructive interference pattern. If we can broadcast this from the top of the spire, we won't just jam them. We'll vibrate the obsidian structures until they shatter at a molecular level." "But to broadcast it," Sarah Jenkins added, looking at the obsidian spire now towering miles into the grey haze above the peak, "we have to interface with the spire itself. We have to use their own hardware to deliver our virus." "The fourth hour is striking," Vance said, pointing to the sky. A sound like a cathedral bell made of ice echoed across the Ural range. The air didn't just vibrate, it hummed with a crystalline clarity. Across the valley, the flickering Soviet soldiers suddenly stood at attention. Their eyes turned into twin pools of indigo light. The synchronization wasn't happening in waves anymore. It was a total immersion. "They're losing them," Major Kovac shouted, watching his fellow countrymen turn into hollow vessels. "Into the base. Now," Vance commanded. Base 211 was a labyrinth of 1950s technology and raw, unhewn magnetite. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and high-voltage ozone. As they hurried toward the central elevator that led to the summit, the walls began to bleed a black, oily substance. It wasn't oil. It was liquid logic, the void's way of rewriting the mountain's mineral structure. "The architect is already here," Sarah whispered, her fingers tracing the black streaks. "It's not walking this time. It's infusing. It's turning the mountain into a giant processor." They reached the summit elevator, a cage of heavy iron. As they ascended, the rock around them disappeared, replaced by the translucent, geometric obsidian of the spire. They were rising through the heart of the enemy's beacon. Inside the spire, they could see files of human history floating in the dark. Images of the Roman legions, the smoke of the Industrial Revolution, the faces of children from 1920s Paris. All of it was being pulled into the obsidian, being compressed and deleted. "It's beautiful in a horrific way," Thorne murmured, watching a century of human art dissolve into a single geometric equation. "It's a theft," Vance snapped. "Focus on the briefcase, Eris." The elevator stopped at the apex. The roof of the spire was an open platform overlooking the entire Ural range. From this height, they could see the graying of the world. The matte grey clouds were spreading across the horizon, erasing the curves of the Earth into flat, Euclidean planes. In the center of the platform stood the architect. It was larger than before, its geometric body now a kaleidoscope of every human face it had ever deleted. It stood before a pulsing core of pure ultraviolet light, the heart of the global synchronization. "The fourth hour is the hour of order," the architect's voice resonated, shaking the very bones of the survivors. "You bring a virus to a god. You bring noise to a symphony of silence. We bring the truth," Sarah yelled, stepping forward. A symphony without a listener isn't music, it's just math. And we are the only ones who can hear the discord you're creating. Vance didn't wait for the philosophical debate. He moved with the practiced lethality of a man who had survived a dozen shadow wars. He fired a specialized grappling line into the ceiling of the obsidian spire, swinging himself over the architect's head toward the ultraviolet core. "Thorn! The briefcase!" Vance yelled mid-air. Thorn slid the briefcase across the glass floor. The architect raised a hand, and the air between Thorn and the briefcase solidified into a wall of obsidian. But Kovac was ready. He threw his final thermal grenade at the base of the wall. The explosion didn't shatter the obsidian, but the sudden heat caused a glitch in the local reality, a momentary softening of the stone. The briefcase slid through. Vance caught it, landed near the core, and slammed the lead-lined box into the ultraviolet light. The core didn't reject it. It hungered for information. The omega frequency began to pour into the void's network. The effect was violent. The ultraviolet light turned a sickly, bruised green. The obsidian walls of the spire began to develop cracks that weren't physical, but informational. Deep, jagged lines of static tore through the architect's body. The faces on its skin began to scream, not in pain, but in liberation. Error. The architect vibrated, its form flickering wildly between a man and a shapeless void. Historical variables re-emerging. Symmetry collapsing. "It's working," Sarah cried, watching the grey horizon. For a fleeting second, a flash of blue sky appeared over the distant horizon. The statues in Yakutsk, 500 kilometers away, probably felt their hearts beat for a single glorious second. But the void wasn't finished. The spire began to pulse with a dark, heavy energy. It was trying to purge the omega frequency by overloading the mountain's magnetite. "The mountain is going to blow," Thorn screamed, checking his sensors. "The magnetite can't ground this much feedback. Vance, we have to pull the briefcase, or the entire range will turn into a crater." Vance looked at the briefcase, then at the architect, which was slowly regaining its form. If he pulled the frequency now, the synchronization would resume. If he stayed, the mountain would become a tomb. "Sarah, Thorn, Kovac, get to the elevator," Vance ordered, his hand gripping the briefcase handle. "Not without you, Colonel," Kovac barked. "That's an order, Major. This frequency needs a manual override to stay locked in the core. Someone has to hold the connection while the mountain grounds the first wave." The architect lunged toward Vance, its obsidian hand reaching for his throat. Vance pulled his combat knife, the one he'd used to anchor himself in the bunker, and jammed it into the architect's geometric chest. The knife didn't cut. It acted as a new grounding wire. The omega frequency surged through Vance, through the knife, and directly into the heart of the architect. A blinding flash of green and white light consumed the summit. The mountain didn't explode. It screamed, a tectonic, soul-shaking sound that echoed from the Urals to the Pacific. The spire shattered, not into dust, but into millions of harmless, fading sparks. The indigo light vanished. The grey clouds broke. For the first time in weeks, the sun, the real, warm, golden sun, hit the peaks of the Ural Mountains. Thorn, Sarah, and Kovac stumbled out of the elevator at the base of the mountain. They looked up. The spire was gone. The architect was gone. The sky was blue. "Vance," Sarah whispered, her eyes searching the smoking peak. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind through the pines. But then, Kovac's radio crackled. It wasn't the voice of the void. It wasn't static. It was a rhythmic, steady signal. dot dot dot, dash dash dash, dot dot dot, SOS. He's alive, Thorne breathed, tears streaming down his face. He's still up there. But as they looked at the radio, the signal changed. It wasn't a call for help anymore. The SOS faded, replaced by a new, clear broadcast. A voice that wasn't distorted, but wasn't quite human either. It was Vance's voice, but it was carrying the weight of 1,000 deleted histories. "The fifth hour has been averted," the voice said, echoing across every radio on the planet. "But the clock has been replaced. We are no longer hidden. We are the new architects." The sun that rose over the Ural Mountains was not the sun the world remembered. It was too sharp, its light revealing textures in the air that shouldn't exist, shimmering lattices of data that hung over the trees like frozen spiderwebs. Colonel Vance was gone from the peak, but his voice remained, a ghostly resonance vibrating through every speaker, every headset, and every mind that had survived the fourth hour. "The frequency has shifted," Dr. Thorne whispered, adjusting the dials on a makeshift receiver as they sat in the back of a moving Soviet transport. Sarah Jenkins sat opposite him, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky seemed to flicker every few seconds. Major Kovac drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, though he was now a man of two worlds. His skin still bore the faint, iridescent sheen of the void's touch. They were heading west, toward the Baltic coast. The Omega frequency had shattered the spire, but it hadn't closed the wound. Instead, it had caused a partial merging. The two dimensions were now overlapping like a double-exposed photograph. In some places, the grass was green. In others, it was composed of violet glass. People were waking up in the cities, but they were different. They remembered things that hadn't happened. Lives lived in the obsidian cities, languages spoken in the static. "We didn't save the world, Eris," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "We just forced a coexistence, and the void doesn't know how to share." "Vance does," Thorne replied. "He didn't die up there. He became the bridge. When he grounded the Omega frequency through the architect, he uploaded his own consciousness, his own human noise, into their network. He's the ghost in their machine now, but he's fighting a 1,000,000,000-to-1 battle." The radio crackled. Vance's voice, layered with a metallic echo, drifted through the cabin. "Sector 9, the Riga threshold. It is the final anchor. If they lock the Baltic gates, the overlap becomes permanent. The friction will ignite the atmosphere. You have to sever the connection." "Sever it how, Vance?" Kovac shouted at the radio. "The void is no longer an invader," the voice responded, fading into a digital hiss. "It is a reflection. To stop the fire, you have to break the mirror. Reach the lighthouse at Cape Coca. I will meet you there." At the end, the journey to the Baltic was a transit through a hallucinatory landscape. The fifth hour was not a sound, but a feeling, a sense of impending weight, as if the sky was a sheet of lead slowly descending. As they reached the Latvian coast, the Baltic Sea was no longer water. It was a vast, undulating field of liquid silver, reflecting a sky filled with the inverted towers of the void's capital. Cape Coca stood at the edge of the world. The old stone lighthouse, built to guide sailors through the treacherous meeting of the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Riga, was now the focal point of the final transition. A massive, swirling vortex of red and violet energy was centered directly above the lantern room. "The architect is regrouping," Sarah said, pointing to the base of the lighthouse. It wasn't just one entity this time. Dozens of sentinels stood in a circle around the tower, their translucent bodies humming in unison. They were weaving the reality back together, trying to smooth out the human noise Vance had introduced. But as the team approached, the sentinels didn't attack. They parted, creating a path toward the lighthouse door. "It's a trap," Kovac muttered, drawing his sidearm. "No," Thorne said, looking at the way the sentinels flickered. "They're confused. Vance is throwing their internal logic into a loop. He's inviting us in." They entered the lighthouse, climbing the spiral stone stairs. With every step, the temperature dropped. By the time they reached the lantern room, the walls were coated in a thick frost that glowed with a faint, rhythmic pulse. In the center of the room, where the great lens should have been, stood a figure of pure, blinding white light. It had Vance's silhouette, but its surface was a rushing river of human memories, flashes of war, love, music, and suffering. It was a concentrated burst of humanity held together by sheer willpower. "Colonel," Sarah whispered. The figure turned. Its face was a blur of features, settling for a moment on the hard, weathered face of Harrison Vance. "The merger is nearly complete," the voice echoed, no longer coming from a radio, but from the walls themselves. "If the sun sets on this overlap, the two worlds will fuse into a graveyard. The human frequency is too loud for their symmetry. We will burn out in a matter of days." "How do we break the mirror, Vance?" Thorne asked, his voice trembling. "We used the Omega frequency. We used the lullaby. What's left?" "Sacrifice," Vance replied. His glowing hand pointed toward the Silver Sea. "The void is anchored by its hunger for order. I am the only thing keeping that hunger from consuming the Baltic threshold. But I am fading. My noise is being filtered out." Vance's form flickered, revealing the obsidian city behind him. "You have the final component, Eris. The 0-point key, your uncle, hidden in the Aleutian tapes. It's not a code. It's a physical reset." Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming glass cylinder he had carried since Alaska. He had never known what it was, only that it felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with mass. "That cylinder contains a fragment of the 59 event," Vance explained. "A piece of pure, unvibrated space. If you shatter it in the heart of the vortex, it will create a vacuum that the void cannot fill. It will pull the overlap apart, sending them back to the static and us back to the mud." "And you?" Sarah asked, her eyes filling with tears. Vance looked at the Silver Sea, his form growing more translucent by the second. "I am part of the frequency now, Sarah. If the mirror breaks, I break with it. But I'd rather be a broken memory in a free world than a perfect slave in a dead one." Suddenly, the lighthouse shook. The sentinels outside had finished their recalibration. The indigo light returned with a vengeance, clawing at the walls of the lantern room. The architect was no longer a man-shape. It was a vast, geometric storm, swirling around the lighthouse, trying to crush the noise at the center. "The 6th hour is striking," Thorne yelled, the glass cylinder vibrating in his hand. "Do it, Eris." Vance's voice was a roar now, a defiant human scream against the encroaching silence. "Break the mirror. Save the story." Thorne raised the cylinder. Kovac and Sarah grabbed his arms, adding their strength, their history, and their will to the act. Together, they slammed the glass against the stone floor of the lighthouse. The world stopped. For a heartbeat, there was no sound. Then a crack appeared, not in the floor, but in the air itself. A thin, white line of nothingness began to spread from the shattered cylinder. It wasn't light, and it wasn't dark. It was the absence of frequency. The Silver Sea began to boil. The obsidian towers in the sky began to stretch and tear like wet paper. The sentinels outside vanished in a puff of grey ash. Vance's glowing form began to dissolve into the white line. He looked at his team one last time, A soldier, a scientist, a dreamer, and a survivor. He didn't say goodbye. He simply smiled, a human, flawed, and beautiful smile. "Welcome to the end of the broadcast," he whispered. A wave of absolute whiteness erupted from the Cape Coca lighthouse, sweeping across the Baltic, across Siberia, and across the world. It didn't burn. It didn't erase. It simply reset. The white light that erupted from the Cape Coca lighthouse did not fade like a flash. It settled like a new morning. When Eris Thorne, Sarah Jenkins, and Major Kovac finally opened their eyes, the Silver Sea was gone. The Baltic was once again a dark, restless blue, its waves crashing against the jagged rocks of the Latvian coast with a familiar, rhythmic chaos. The lighthouse was empty. The frost had melted, leaving only the smell of salt and old stone. There was no glowing figure, no obsidian city in the sky, and no metallic voice in their heads. The silence was no longer heavy. It was just the natural quiet of a world that had survived a fever. "He's gone," Sarah whispered, her breath hitching in the cold air. She looked at the spot where the glass cylinder had shattered. There was nothing left, not even a shard. The 0-point reset had been absolute. "He's not just gone," Thorne said, looking at his frequency analyzer. "The screen was dead. He's disconnected." Vance took the entire Void network with him when he collapsed the bridge. He didn't just save us. He closed the door and took the key to the other side. They walked out of the lighthouse and down to the shore. The world they stepped into was the world they had lost, but the scars were everywhere. In the distance, they could see the paused people finally moving again. They were stumbling, confused, clutching their heads as they tried to reconcile the two sets of memories now living in their brains. The transition had left its mark, a global scar of shared trauma and impossible knowledge. Major Kovac looked at his hands. The iridescent sheen was gone, but his skin felt cold, as if he was still standing in the shadow of the Black Mountain. "The Cold War is over," he said, looking at the horizon. "Washington and Moscow won't care about borders anymore. Not after this. They'll be too busy trying to hide what we've seen." "They can try," Sarah said, her voice regaining its strength. "But you can't erase a vibration that everyone felt. The story is out there now. It's in the static. It's in the way the stars look a little bit brighter than they used to." As they drove away from Cape Coca, they turned on the truck's radio. Across every frequency, there was only white noise. But as Thorne tuned the dial, he found a single, faint signal. It wasn't a voice. It was a heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. It was the pulse of a world that was learning how to breathe again. The archives of Project Blue Winter were eventually buried in lead-lined vaults, labeled as mass hallucinations or atmospheric anomalies. The names Vance, Thorne, and Jenkins were scrubbed from the official records, turned into ghosts by the very governments they had saved. But in the deep-crust bunkers and the high-altitude listening posts, the technicians still listen. They listen for the lullaby. They listen for the return of the indigo light, because they know that the mirror wasn't destroyed, it was only shattered, and somewhere, in the vast, unvibrated silence between the stars, the pieces are waiting to be put back together. The Void Protocol wasn't an event, it was a warning, and the clock, though silent for now, is always counting down. History is a broadcast, and we are just the listeners. But for one brief, terrifying moment in the winter of 1978, a few brave souls decided to change the channel. They chose the friction of life over the symmetry of death. They chose the dark mystery of Eldermurk over the perfect light of the void. Stay vigilant, watch the static, and never trust a signal that sounds too perfect. The file on the Void Protocol is now closed, but the shadows it cast will never truly vanish. If you have found yourself looking at the sky and seeing a shimmer that shouldn't be there, or if the static on your radio sounds like a voice you almost recognize, then you are already part of the archives. To ensure you never miss a transmission from the edge of the unknown, make sure to subscribe to Eldermurk, like this record to signal your presence in the network, and share your own anomalies in the comments below. The truth is a frequency, and we are the only ones left to tune it. Until the next hour strikes, stay in the shadows. This has been Eldermurk.